Well, after Charles Fox Parham, then we have a man named William Seymour. William Seymour was one of Charles Fox Parham's students. Parham was a racist, though, because obviously you can tell Mr. Seymour was a black man, and Parham would not allow Seymour to be in the same room with the other white students. Seymour, he said, you're going to have to sit outside, and so Seymour had to listen actually through the window, but he would do so. He would sit outside and listen to Charles Fox Parham through the window. So after Seymour left Parham, then Seymour started his own thing, and he started a church in Los Angeles on Azusa Street. This is where the Azusa revival started. That's why it's called that. And at Azusa, tongues apparently broke out in some of William Seymour's meetings. People spoke in tongues and this gibberish. There was bizarre behavior. People were rolling around on the floor. They were having spasms. They got rigid. They had trances and visions. And Charles Fox Parham heard about all this, and he went to see it for himself, and he rejected it. He rejected all this, not on theological grounds, but he rejected it simply because of his racism. He didn't believe that God could move so powerfully through a black man. Seymour, however, was no saint himself. William Seymour rarely, if ever, preached the gospel. Bizarrely, William Seymour would prophesy with a wooden box over his head. That's what he would do. I don't know if he just needed to, block out any distractions or whatever, but he would be seen literally getting a wooden box and putting it on his head, and that's where he would get his visions and trances. He would be seen walking up and down the aisle of his church, and as he would do so, people would literally stuff money in his pockets as he walked by, and his pockets would be full of money, $5 and $10 bills, and so he was no saint himself. But today there are 26 different charismatic denominations, all of which trace their history back to William Seymour and the Azusa revival. You may have heard there are different waves to the charismatic movement. Maybe you've heard of this. There's first wave, second wave, third wave. So let me give you an overview of this. The first wave was the Azusa revival, what began under William Seymour. Now, a lot of these charismatics with the Azusa revival and the ones that came after it were theological heretics in that they denied the Trinity. They were oneness Pentecostals, oneness charismatics. In other words, they believed in what's called modalism. They rejected the Trinity. They believed that God is one God who just changes modes. Sometimes God has his Father hat on, then sometimes he'll have his Jesus hat on, then he'll have his Holy Spirit hat on. So they rejected the Trinity, and that is heresy known as modalism. So this presented a problem for the Trinitarian charismatics because they saw the oneness Pentecostals, the oneness charismatics, and the oneness folks who were clearly not Christian. I mean, if you reject the Trinity, you're not a Christian. And yet, these oneness charismatics spoke in tongues in exactly the same way that the Trinitarian charismatics did. And so that was an obvious logical problem for them, right? And then you have the second wave. This was the charismatic renewal that began in the 1960s. It began in an Episcopal church when the priest of that church, a man named Dennis Bennett, claimed to have gotten baptized in the Holy Spirit, and he began to speak in tongues. And it began with this Episcopal priest in an Episcopal church, but then it spread to other denominations. And so now within the charismatic movement, you've got Methodist charismatics, you've got Anglican charismatics, you've even got Roman Catholic charismatics. There's a sizable contingency of Roman Catholics who also speak in tongues, just like Protestant charismatics do. And it's in the charismatic renewal, the second wave, that you see the rise of the prosperity gospel and the word of faith movement with men like Kenneth Hagin, Oral Roberts. Some of you older saints remember him. And then you have the third wave, and this began in the 1980s. The third wave, this was a term that was coined by C. Peter Wagner. And Peter Wagner kept the prosperity teachings of the second wave, but in this third wave, he placed an even greater emphasis on modern-day apostles, signs and wonders. With the third wave, you have the Vineyard movement, the Toronto and the Brownsville revivals, and of course now Bethel Church and all that. So the third wave kind of gave rise to the New Apostolic Reformation movement. So these are the three different waves. So if you hear these terms, you'll kind of know roughly what they're talking about. Another one of God's generals in the charismatic movement is a guy named John G. Lake.